Famloy Englawana Cthulhu Rally Fatago. Famloy Englawana Cthulhu Rally Fatago. Famloy Englawana Cthulhu Rally Fatago.
Welcome to the 218th of the Cthulhu podcasts. I'm Felbrick. Today we're starting off with the next part of Mr. Standfast. Then we'll have a musical number, and then back for a news story from Mr. William Hope Hodgson. Let's get started. Chapter 15. St. Anton. 10 days later, the porter, Joseph Zimmer of Arosa, clad in the tough, shapeless trousers of his class, but sporting an old velveteen shooting coat bequeathed to him by a former German master, and speaking the guttural tongue of the Grisons, and with all his belongings in one massive rucksack, came out of the little station of St. Anton, and blinked in the frosty sunshine. He looked down upon the little old village beside its ice-bound lake, but his business was with the new village of hostels and villas which had sprung up in the last 10 years south of the station. He made some halting inquiries of the station people, and a cab driver outside finally directed him to the place he sought, the cottage of the widow Summermatter, where resided an English intern, one Peter Pinard. The porter, Joseph Zimmer, had had a long roundabout journey. A fortnight before he had worn the uniform of a British Major General. As such, he had been the inmate of an expensive Paris hotel, till one morning, in grey tweed clothes and with a limp, he had taken the Paris Mediterranean Express with a ticket for an officer's convalescent home at Cannes. Thereafter he had declined in the social scale. At Dijon he had still been an Englishman, but at Pontlier he had become an American bagman of Swiss parentage, returning to wind up his father's estate. At Bern he limped excessively, and at Zurich, at a little back-street hotel, he became frankly the peasant. For he met a friend there from whom he acquired clothes with an odd rank smell, far stronger than Harris tweed, which marks the raiment of most Swiss guides and all Swiss porters. He also acquired a new name and an old aunt, who was a little later receiving him with open arms and explained to her friends that he was her brother's son from Arosa, who 3 winters ago had hurt his leg wood-cutting and had been discharged from the levee. A kindly Swiss gentleman, as it chanced, had heard of the deserving Joseph, and interested himself to find him employment. The said philanthropist made a hobby of the French and British prisoners returned from Germany, and had in mind an officer, a crabbed South African with a bad leg, who needed a servant. He was, it seemed, an ill-tempered old fellow, who had to be billeted alone, and since he could speak German, he would be happier with a Swiss native. Joseph haggled somewhat over the wages, but on his aunt's advice he accepted the job, and with a very complete set of papers and a store of ready-made reminiscences, it took him some time to swat up the names of the peaks and passes he had traversed, set out for St. Anton, having dispatched beforehand a monstrously ill-spelt letter announcing his coming. He could barely read and write, but he was good at maps, which he had studied carefully, and he noticed with satisfaction that the valley of St. Anton gave easy access to Italy. As he journeyed south, the reflections of that porter would have surprised his fellow travellers in the stuffy third-class carriage. He was thinking of a conversation he had had some days before in a café at Dijon with a young Englishman bound for Modane. We'd bumped up against each other by chance in that strange flitting, when all went to different places at different times, asking nothing of each other's business. Wake had greeted me rather shamefacedly, and had proposed dinner together. I'm not good at receiving apologies, and Wake's embarrassed me more than they embarrassed him. I'm a bit of a cad sometimes, he said. You know I'm a better fellow than I sounded that night, Hanny. I mumbled something about not talking rot, the conventional phrase. What worried me was that the man was suffering. You could see it in his eyes. But that evening I got nearer Wake than ever before, and he and I became true friends, for he laid bare his soul before me. That was his trouble, that he could lay bare his soul, for ordinary healthy folk don't analyse their feelings. Wake did, and I think it brought him relief. Don't think I was ever your rival. I would no more have proposed to Mary than I would have married one of her aunts. She was so sure of herself, so happy in her single-heartedness, that she terrified me. My type of man is not meant for marriage, for women must be in the centre of life, and we must always be standing aside and looking on. It is a damnable thing to be left-handed. The trouble about you, my dear chap, I said, is that you're too hard to please. That's one way of putting it. I should put it more harshly. I hate more than I love. All we humanitarians and pacifists have hatred as our mainspring. Odd, isn't it, for people who preach brotherly love? But it's the truth. We're full of hate towards everything that doesn't square in with our ideas, everything that jars on our ladylike nerves. Fellows like you are so in love with their cause that they've no time or inclination to detest what thwarts them. We've no cause, only negatives, and that means hatred and self-torture and a beastly jaundice of soul. Then I knew that Wake's fault was not spiritual pride as I had diagnosed it at Biggleswick. The man was abased with humility. I see more than other people see, he went on, and I feel more. That's the curse on me. You're a happy man, and you get things done because you only see one side of a case, one thing at a time. How would you like it if 1,000 strings were always tugging at you? If you saw that every course meant the sacrifice of lovely and desirable things, or even the shattering of what you know to be irreplaceable? I'm the kind of stuff poets are made of, but I haven't the poet's gift, and so I stagger about the world left-handed and game-legged. Take the war. For me to fight would be worse than for another man to run away. From the bottom of my heart I still believe that it didn't have to have happened, and that all war is a blistering iniquity. And yet belief has got very little to do with virtue. I'm not as good a man as you, Hanny, who's never thought out anything in your life. My time in the Labour Battalion taught me something. I knew that with all my fine aspirations, I wasn't as true a man as fellows who talk with silly oaths and who didn't give a tinker's curse about their soul. I remember that I looked at him with sudden understanding. I think I know you. You're the sort of chap who won't fight for his country because he can't be sure that she's altogether in the right, but he'd cheerfully die for her, right or wrong. His face relaxed in a slow smile. Queer that you should say that. I think it's pretty much near the truth. Men like me aren't afraid to die, but they haven't quite the courage to live. Every man should be happy in service, like you, when he obeys orders. I couldn't get on in any service. I lack the bump of veneration. I can't swallow things merely because I'm told to. My sort are always talking about service, but we haven't the temperament to serve. I'd give all I have to be an ordinary cog in the wheel instead of a confounded outsider who finds fault with the machinery. Take a great, violent, high-handed fellow like you. You can sink yourself till you become only a name and a number. I couldn't if I tried. I'm not sure if I want to either. I cling to the odds and the ends that are my own. I wish I had you in my battalion a year ago, I said. No, you don't. I'd only have been a nuisance. I've been a Fabian since Oxford, but you're a better socialist than me. I'm a rancid individualist. But you must be feeling better about the war, I asked. No, not a bit of it. I'm still lusting for the heads of the politicians that made it and continue it. But I want to help my country. Honestly, Hanny, I love the old place. More, I think, than I love myself, and that's saying a devilish lot. Short of fighting, which would be the sin against the Holy Spirit for me, I'll do my damnedest. But you'll remember I'm not used to teamwork. If I'm a jealous player, beat me over the head. His voice was almost wistful, and I liked him enormously. Blenkeron will see to that, I said. We're going to break you to harness, Wake, and then you'll be a happy man. You keep your mind on the game and forget about yourself. That's the cure for jibbers. As I journeyed to St. Anton, I thought a lot about that talk. He was quite right about Mary, who would never have married him. A man with such an angular soul couldn't fit into another's. And then I thought that the chief thing about Mary was just her serene certainty. Her eyes had that settled look that I remembered to have seen only in one other human face, and that was Peter's. But I wondered if Peter's eyes were still the same. I found the cottage, a little wooden thing which had been left perched on its knoll when the big hotels grew around it. It had a fence in front, but behind it was open to the hillside. At the gate stood a bent old woman with a face like a pippin. My make-up must have been good, for she accepted me before I introduced myself. "God be thanked you're come," she cried. "The poor lieutenant needed a man to keep him company. He sleeps now, as he does always in the afternoon, for his leg wearies him in the night. But he is brave, like a soldier. Come, I'll show you the house, for you two will be alone now." Stepping softly, she led me indoors, pointing with a warning finger to a little bedroom where Peter slept. I found a kitchen with a big stove and a rough floor of planking, on which lay some badly cured skins. Off it was a sort of pantry, with a bed for me. She showed me the pots, the pans for cooking, and the stores she had laid in, and where to find water and fuel. "I will do the marketing daily," she said, "and if you need me, my dwelling is 1/2 a mile up the road beyond the new church. God be with you, young man, and be kind to that wounded one." When the widow Summer Matter had departed, I sat down in Peter's armchair and took stock of the place. It was quiet and simple and homely, and through the window came the gleam of snow on the diamond hills. On the table beside the stove were Peter's cherished belongings, his buckskin pouch and a pipe which Janny Grobbelaar had carved for him in St. Helena, an aluminium-filled matchbox I'd given him, a cheap large-print Bible such as padres present to well-disposed privates, and an old battered Pilgrim's Progress with gaudy pictures. The illustration at which I opened showed Faithful going up to heaven from the fire of Vanity Fair, like a woodcock that's just been flushed. Everything in the room was exquisitely neat, and I knew that was Peter and not the widow Summer Matter. On a peg behind the door hung his much-mended coat, and sticking out of a pocket I recognized a sheaf of my own letters. In one corner stood something which I'd forgotten about, an invalid chair. The sight of Peter's plain little oddments made me feel solemn. I wondered if his eyes would be like Mary's now, for I could not conceive what life would be for him as a cripple. Very silently I opened the bedroom door and slipped inside. He was lying on a camp bedstead, with one of those striped Swiss blankets pulled up around his ears, and he was asleep. It was the old Peter, beyond doubt. He had the hunter's gift of breathing evenly through his nose, and the white scar on the deep brown of his forehead was what I always remembered. The only change since I last saw him was that he had let his beard grow again, and it was grey. As I looked at him, the remembrance of all that we'd been through together flooded back upon me, and I could have cried with joy at being beside him. Women, bless their hearts, can never know what long comradeship means to men. It is something not in their lives, something that belongs only to that wild, undomesticated world which we forswear when we find our mates. Even Mary understood only a bit of it. I just won her love, which was the greatest thing that ever came my way, but if she had entered at that moment, I would have scarcely turned my head. I was back again in the old life. I was not thinking of the new. Suddenly I saw that Peter was awake and was looking at me. "Dick," he said in a whisper. "Dick, my old friend." The blanket was tossed off, and his long, lean arms were stretched out to me. I gripped his hands, and for a little we did not speak. And then I saw how woefully he had changed. His left leg had shrunk, and from the knee down was like a pipe stem. His face, when awake, showed the lines of hard suffering, and he seemed shorter by 1/2 a foot. But his eyes were still like Mary's. Indeed, they seemed to be more patient and peaceful than in the days when he sat beside me on the buck wagon and peered over the hunting veld. I picked him up, he was no heavier than Mary, and carried him to his chair beside the stove. Then I boiled water and made tea, as we had so often done together. "Peter, old man," I said, "we're on a trek again, and this is a very snug little rendezvous. We've had many good yarns, but this is going to be the best. First of all, though, how about your health?" "Good. I'm a strong man again, but slow like a hippo cow. I've been lonely sometimes, but that is all by now. Tell me of the big battles." But I was hungry for news of him, and kept him to his own case. He had no complaint of his treatment except that he did not like Germans. The doctors at the hospital had been clever, he said, and had done their best for him. But nerves and sinews and small bones had been so wrecked that they could not mend his leg. And Peter had all the Boer's dislike of amputation. One doctor had been in Damaraland and talked to him of those baked sunny places and made him homesick. But he returned always to his dislike of Germans. He'd seen them herding our soldiers like brute beasts, and the commandant had a face like Stum, and a chin that stuck out and wanted hitting. He made an exception for the great airman Lensch who had downed him. "He's a white man, that one," he said. "He came to see me in hospital, and told me of a lot of things. I think he made them treat me well. He's a big man, Dick, who would make two of me, and he has a round, merry face and pale eyes like Fricky Selliers, who'd put a bullet through a Boer's head at 200 yards. He said he was sorry I was lame, for he hoped to have more fights with me. Some woman that tells fortunes had said that I would be the end of him, but he reckoned she had got the thing the wrong way round. I hope he will come through this war, for he is a good man, though a German. But the others, they're like the fool in the Bible, fat and ugly in good fortune, and proud and vicious when their luck goes. They're not a people to be happy with." Then he told me that to keep his spirits he had amused himself with playing a game. He'd prided himself on being a Boer, and spoken coldly of the British. He had also, I gathered, imparted many things calculated to deceive. So he left Germany with good marks, and in Switzerland had held himself aloof from the other British wounded on the advice of Blencaron, whom had met him as soon as he crossed the frontier. I gathered it was Blencaron who had set him to St. Anton, and in his time there as a disgruntled Boer, he'd mixed a great deal with Germans. They'd pumped him about our air service, and Peter had told them many ingenious lies and heard many curious things in return. "They're working hard, Dick," he said. "Never forget that. The German is a stout enemy, and when we beat him with a machine he sweats until he has invented a new one. They have great pilots, but never so many good ones as we, and I do not think in ordinary fighting they can ever beat us. But you must watch Lensch, for I fear him. He has a new machine, I hear, with great engines and a short wing spread, but the wings so cambered that he can climb fast. That'll be a surprise to spring upon us. You'll say that we'll soon better it, so we shall, but if it was used at a time when we were pushing hard, it might make the little difference that loses battles." "You mean," I said, "that if we had a great attack ready, and had driven all the Boche planes back from our front, Lensch and his circus might get over in spite of us, and blow the gaff?" "Yes," he said solemnly. "Or if we were attacked, and had a weak spot, Lensch might show the Germans where to get through. I do not think we're going to attack for a long time, but I'm pretty sure that Germany is going to fling every man against us. That is the talk of my friends, and it's not bluff." Now it's time to start the new story. This is Chapter 1 of William Hope Hodgson's The Ghost Ship. Chapter 1. The Figure Out of the Sea. He began without any circumlocution. I joined the Mortzestus in Frisco. I heard, before I signed on, that there were some funny yarns floating around about her, but I was pretty nearly on the beach and too jolly anxious to get away to worry about trifles. Besides, by all accounts, she was right enough so far as grub and treatment went. When I asked fellows to give it a name, they generally could not. All they could tell me was that she was unlucky, and made thundering long passages, and had no more than a fair share of dirty weather. Also, that she had twice had the sticks blown out of her, and her cargo had shifted. Besides all these, a heap of other things that might happen to any packet, and would not be comfortable to run into. Still, they were ordinary things, and I was willing enough to risk them to get home. All the same, if I'd been given the chance, I should have shipped in some other vessel as a matter of preference. When I took my bag down, I found that they had signed on the rest of the crowd. You see, the home lot cleared out when they got into Frisco. That is, all except one young fellow, a Cockney, who'd stuck by the ship in port. He told me afterwards, when I got to know him, that he intended to draw a payday out of her, whether anyone else did or not. The first night I was in her, I found that it was common talk amongst the other fellows that there was something queer about the ship. They spoke of her as if it were an accepted fact that she was haunted, yet they all treated the matter as a joke. All, that is, except the young Cockney, Williams, who, instead of laughing at their jests on the subject, seemed to take the whole matter seriously. This made me rather curious. I began to wonder whether there was, after all, some truth underlying the vague stories I had heard, and I took the first opportunity to ask him whether he had any reasons for believing that there was anything in the yarns about the ship. At first he was inclined to be a bit offish, but presently he came round, and told me that he did not know of any particular incident which could be called unusual in the sense in which I meant, yet that, at the same time, there were lots of little things which, if you put them together, made you think a bit. For instance, she always made such long passages, and had so much dirty weather. Nothing but and calms and headwinds. Then other things happened. Sails that he knew himself had been properly stowed were always blowing adrift, at night. And then he said a thing that surprised me. "There's too many bloomin' shadders about this here packet. They gets onto your nerves like nothing as ever I've seen before in me nat'ral." He blurted it all out in a heap, and I turned round and looked at him. "Too many shadows?" I said. "What on earth do you mean?" But he refused to explain himself or tell me anything further, just shook his head stupidly. That's when I questioned him. He seemed to have taken a sudden sulky fit. I felt certain that he was acting dense purposefully. I believe the truth of the matter is that he was in a way ashamed of having let himself go like he had, in speaking out his thoughts about shadows. That type of man may think things at times, but he doesn't often put them into words. Anyhow, I saw that it was no use asking any further questions, so I let the matter drop there. Yet for several days afterwards, I caught myself wondering at times what the fellow had meant by shadows. We left Frisco the next day, with a fine fair wind that seemed a bit like putting the stopper on the yarns I'd heard about the ship's ill luck. And yet... He hesitated a moment, and then went on again. For the first couple of weeks out, nothing unusual happened, and the wind was still fair. I began to feel that I'd been rather lucky, after all, in the packet into which I'd been shunted. Most of the other fellows gave her a good name, and there was a pretty general opinion growing amongst the crowd that it was all a silly yarn about her being haunted. And then, just when I was settling down to things, something happened that opened my eyes no end. It was in the 8 to 12 watch, and I was sitting on the steps on the starboard side, leading up to the forecastle head. The night was fine, and there was a splendid moon. Away aft I heard the timekeeper strike 4 bells, and the lookout, an old fellow named Jaskett, answered him. As he let go the bell lanyard, he caught sight of me where I sat quietly smoking. He leant over the rail and looked down at me. "That you, Jessup?" he asked. "I believe it is," I replied. "Well, have our grandmothers and all the rest of the petticoated relishing and coming out to sea if it were always like this," he remarked reflectively, indicating with a sweep of his pipe and hand the calmness of the sea and sky. I saw no reason for denying that, and he continued. "If this old packet is haunted, and some of 'em seems to think, well, all I could say is let 'em have the luck to tumble across one of the other sort. Good grub and duff for Sundays, and a decent crowd of them aft, and everything comfortable like, so as you can feel where you knows where you are. And for her being haunted, well, that's all hellish nonsense. I've come across lots of 'em as before as said to be haunted, and to some of 'em was, but 'twasn't with ghostesses. One packet I was in, they was as bad as you couldn't sleep a wink in your watch below until you'd had every stitch out of your bunk and had a regular hunt. Sometimes, at that moment, the Relief, one of the ordinary seamen, went up the other ladder onto the forecastle head, and the old chap turned to ask him why the hell had he not relieved him a bit smarter. The ordinary made some reply, but what it was I did not catch, for abruptly, away aft, my rather sleepy gaze had lighted on something altogether extraordinary and outrageous. It was nothing less than the form of a man stepping inboard over the starboard rail, a little abaft the main rigging. I stood up and caught at the handrail and stared. Behind me someone spoke. It was the lookout who had come down off the forecastle head on his way aft to report the name of his Relief to the second mate. "What is it, mate?" he asked curiously, seeing my intent attitude. The thing, whatever it was, had disappeared into the shadows on the lee side of the deck. "Nothing," I replied shortly, for I was too bewildered then at what my eyes had just shown me as to say any more. I wanted to think. The old shellback glanced at me, but only muttered something and went on his way aft. For a minute, perhaps, I stood there, watching, but could see nothing. Then I walked slowly aft as far as the after end of the deck-house. From there I could see most of the main deck, but nothing showed, except, of course, the moving shadows of the ropes and spars and sails as they swung to and fro in the moonlight. The old chap who had just come off the lookout had returned forward again, and I was alone on that part of the deck. And then, all at once, as I stood peering into the shadows to leeward, I remembered what Williams had said about there being too many shadows. I'd been puzzled to understand his real meaning then. I had no difficulty now. There were too many shadows. Yet, shadows or no shadows, I realized that for my own peace of mind I must settle once and for all whether the thing I had seemed to see, stepping aboard out of the ocean, had been a reality, or simply a phantom, as you might say, of my imagination. My reason said it was nothing more than imagination, a rapid dream. I must have dozed. But something deeper than reason told me that this was not so. I put it to the test, and went straight in amongst the shadows. There was nothing. I grew bolder. My common sense told me I must have fancied it all. I walked over to the mainmast and looked behind the pin-rail that partly surrounded it, and down into the shadow of the pumps. But here again was nothing. Then I went in under the break of the poop. It was darker under there than out on the deck. I looked up both sides of the deck, and saw that they were bare of anything such as I looked for. The assurance was comforting. I glanced at the poop ladders and remembered that nothing could have gone up there without the second mate or the timekeeper seeing it. Then I leant back up against the bulkhead, and thought the whole matter over rapidly, sucking at my pipe, and keeping my glance about the deck. I concluded my think and said, "No," out loud. Then something occurred to me, and I said, "Unless," and went over to the starboard bulwarks, and looked over and down into the sea. But there was nothing but sea, and so I turned and made my way forward. My common sense had triumphed, and I was convinced that my imagination had been playing tricks with me. I reached the door on the port side leading into the forecastle, and was about to enter when something made me look behind. As I did so, I had a shaker. Away aft, a dim, shadowy form stood in the wake of the swaying belt of moonlight that swept the deck a bit abaft of the main mast. It was the same figure that I had just been attributing to my fancy. I will admit that I felt more than startled. I was quite a bit frightened. I was convinced now that it was no mere imaginary thing. It was a human figure, and yet with the flicker of the moonlight and the shadows chasing over it, I was unable to say more than that. Then, as I stood there, irresolute and funky, I got the thought that someone was acting the goat, though for what reason or purpose I never stopped to consider. I was glad of any suggestion that my common sense assured me was not impossible, and for the moment I felt quite relieved. That side to the question had not presented itself to me before. I began to pluck up courage. I accused myself of getting fanciful. Otherwise I should have tumbled to it earlier. And then, funnily enough, in spite of all my reasoning, I was still afraid of going aft to discover who that was, standing on the lee side of the main deck. Yet I felt that if I shirked it, I was only fit to be dumped overboard. And so I went, though not with any great speed, as you can imagine. I had gone half the distance, and still the figure remained there, motionless and silent, the moonlight and the shadows playing over it with each roll of the ship. I think I tried to be surprised. If it were one of the fellows playing the fool, he must have heard me coming, and why didn't he scoot while he had the chance? And where could he have hidden himself before? All these things I asked myself in a rush, with a queer mixture of doubt and belief. And you know, in the meantime, I was drawing nearer. I had passed the house, and was not 12 paces distant when, abruptly, the silent figure made 3 quick strides to the port rail, and climbed over it into the sea. I rushed to the side and stared over, but nothing met my gaze, except the shadow of the ship sweeping over the moonlit sea. How long I stared down blankly into the water, it would be impossible to say. Certainly for a good minute. I felt blank, just horribly blank. It was such a beastly confirmation of the unnaturalness of the thing that I concluded to be only a sort of brain fancy. I seemed for that little time deprived, of the power of coherent thought. I suppose I was dazed, mentally stunned in a way. As I have said, a minute or so must have gone while I was there staring into the dark of the water under the ship's side. Then I came suddenly to my ordinary self. The second mate was singing out, "Lee fore brace!" I went to the braces like a chap in a dream. That's all for today, except to mention that my reading of The King in Yellow is now available as an audiobook from audible.com. Opening music is provided by Victor Valdez from the Symbol Project. This file is released on an attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives license. Until next time.
CthulhuPodcast.co.uk